Hey, hello and welcome everyone. I can see people are starting to join us for this webinar this afternoon hosted by the Arab Reform Initiative. I think I'll just wait maybe 1 or 2 more minutes just so that everyone can join the webinar before we start. Okay, just wait another 30 seconds or so, not even 20 seconds. All right, I guess we can go ahead and get started. I'm sure some people still join us. So as I said, thank you everyone for coming today to this webinar entitled Authoritarian Upgrading, How Resilient Are Arab Dictatorships? Today's webinar is the second in a series that we are hosting on the topic of renewing the path to democracy amid crisis. The objectives of this webinar series, there will be 3 webinars in the series, is to really examine from different angles what are the perspectives for a renewal of democratic energy and democratization processes in the Arab region today amid various forms of cascading crises that we're seeing across the region. Our first webinar, which was held, I believe, in February, which is available on our website, was really about the concept itself of democracy in the Arab context and how we can kind of invest that concept and the ideas behind it with something that can generate more popular support to the idea of democracy and support to democracy. Today's webinar is going to be looking instead from a different angle at the issue of authoritarian upgrading and the various forms of the tools, the strategies, the changes in the configurations of power relations and economic relations that various regimes have been utilizing in order to reinforce power structures and reinforce the authoritarian nature of the state. But paradoxically, the new forms of fragility that these strategies of upgrading are actually inducing in the systems in order to really look at how resilient really are these Arab dictatorships. There's this myth, of course, this mantra of the resilience of these dictatorships. And we really want to question if that is the case, how resilient are they in fact, given these various forms of upgrading, but also what are the opportunities as well as constraints for democratic resurgence. So we're going to be looking at the various forms of the tools such as surveillance, the expansion of surveillance, extraterritorial repression, the legal frameworks that are put into place, coup-proofing mechanisms, new political economies that are being adopted, all as part of these regime strategies to reinforce the authoritarian nature of the regime and prevent new forms of threat to regime stability. But as I mentioned, looking at where are the cracks in the system? How is this creating new forms of fragility and new possibilities for opponents, for democratic forces to reemerge and reassert themselves? So we are going to be looking today at 3 comparative case studies. The first will be a look at Egypt, a deeper dive into Egypt. This will include, what we've seen in Egypt has been this incredible crackdown on the opposition, on the civic space, on any forms of opposition, this intensified form of repression since the arrival of the El-Sisi regime, as well as the changing role of the military in power. It's a sort of a double coup-proofing for the military by reasserting the military's role in the economy, as well as preventing the possibility of another mass uprising. But at the same time, the huge cost to this, particularly in terms of, for instance, the economy, the long-term economic consequences of the way these reconfigurations of economic relations and the military's role in the economy are affecting the long-term viability of the state and its economic model. We're going to be looking today at Tunisia, the example of Tunisia, the process of utilizing the tools in place, the institutional tools in place to undo the political system, the democratic system, the various legal frameworks, constitution, the rewriting of the constitution, as well as the various ways in which the opposition has been silenced and emptied out. And considering, what are these new forms of power, but also how this hasn't really responded to any of the crises that led to the arrival of Kais Saied in the presidency in the first place, quite the contrary. And finally, looking at the case of Syria, which up until December, I think most people probably thought that the Assad regime was uncrackable, that this was something we were going to have to deal with for a very long time. And then there was an incredibly rapid reversal of power in Syria. And what's come out from then is that the way in which the regime had so thoroughly closed the civic space, closed the space for opposition, militarized the space, the cost to this was in part, of course, the destruction of the economy and how this affected state-military relations and the degree to which the security services were actually able to or have any loyalty to the Assad regime. So as part of the discussion today, I'm joined by three fantastic speakers, and I'm very excited to be welcoming them today to contribute their insights to this discussion. We have first Dr. Maria Gloria Polimeno, who is a research fellow at the SOAS Middle East Institute. She's a political scientist. She works on a number of different things related to transformative authoritarianism, the legitimacy of political elites, and political economy dynamics through the prism of a social development goals framework. And she's also contributing on the VDEM project on the Tunisian and Egyptian cases. We have Dr. Kevin Kohler, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Santa Anna School of Advanced Studies in Pisa, Italy. He is the PI of the ERC-funded project Political Elites and Regime Change in MENA, which is looking at the dynamics of elite change in several different countries in the region. And finally, we have Gamal Mansour, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, who is looking at state-business relations under authoritarianism, and with a particular case study of looking at state-business relations under the Assad regime. Just as a brief matter of housekeeping, we have 90 minutes total for this webinar. So each speaker will have about 15 minutes to make the presentation. And then I will have 2 sets of questions for everyone, and then we will open it up to the audience. For those who are interested in asking questions, we ask you to please type it into the Q&A in the chat. And when we open the discussion for the audience, we will then pose the questions. I will pose the questions to the audience. So I think with that, we will go ahead and start. We're going to start with Gloria, who will present to us the case of Egypt.
Yes, so hello everyone, thanks for having me as a first thing. So what I'm gonna do, gonna do the next 15 minutes or so is trying to unpack the dynamics of Sisi regimes and how the regime today is like different from 2011 settings. And it is my argument that if we don't look at the substructural mechanism or regime functioning, how they happen to emerge after 2013, there's no chance we can understand how the autocracy, the Egyptian autocracy, is trying to consolidate holds on power, and why we are now you're actually witnessing a new mechanism of repression, coercion, something that at least historically never happened in the past, at least if you look at the level of brutality, to the point that Al-Sisi regime, and let me be straight on this, it's equals a kind of machine of death, something that under Mubarak, since I would say the 1950s, was historically unconceivable, even though repression was still there. I'm not arguing that torture, repression was alien to 1950s, 2011 mechanism regimes functioning, but certainly we're now on a new phase, a new stage, and the way through which it is possible to analyze is by looking at what I framed as a fluid autocracy. So after 2014, we had a crisis of authority, essentially. So the counter-revolution, I mean, what was framed counter-revolution, but in fact, it was a de facto military coup. This critical juncture paved the road to a crisis. This crisis needs to be filled one way or another. Now, the process of legitimation claim that happened to emerge in 2013 settings eventually led up to a substructural transformation of the regime from within the sub-hierarchies of the political and infrastructural apparatus of power. And this real idea of autocracy approximates what I defined, what I categorized for the first time as a non-exclusivist personalist regime. So what I mean by non-exclusivist personalism acknowledge that we have a new trait to Assisi regime that happened to emerge under Assisi along the process of political legitimation as internally conceived, as internally orchestrated, right? That was harder to a pre-existing militarism that, however, underwent substructural transformations. So it could sound complex, is not. What I argue is that this personalist trait is not a one-man show logics or politics of operationalizing politics. I mean, a new politics of for which implementing, power, new logics is not this. It's something that subexits within this transformed militarism. So I acknowledge the fact that the states remain highly militarized, but the legitimate forces enter a new phase and ends up playing a new role within this new idea of autocracy as a non-exclusivist, personalist dictatorships. So personalism additionally end up playing a kind of, if you want to, coup-proofing mechanism. If you divide the elites, if you divide the elite at the substructural level, you end up with 2 or 3 segments of elites that coexist in the system, in the states, in the regime. In this way, it's unlikely that you will face, at least directly, a threat, a political threat, and then you risk of being overthrown by the elite themselves. So personalism was a trait that prevented a coup, at least in initial phase of this new category of autocracy. Now, in this new mechanism of functioning, authoritarian functioning, which is a quite hybrid, you have the very fluid, very fragile, very unstable intra-state, intra-actor relationships. What I mean is that the Egyptian forces, different from pre-time settings, do no longer protect Al-Sisi. So there's no protection pact behind this new architecture of political supports. Al-Sisi is just that man that is providing to the side a civilian face to the autocracy in order to respond to the international demand for the withdrawal of the Egyptian forces, so the military, from the economic apparatuses, from the political scene. It's a condition that happened to be negotiated between intra-actors' interest versus international actors' interest and needs toward the country. Now, in these new machines, in new architecture, political functioning, you have a question, you have repression, you have surveillance. I will start with surveillance, if you don't mind. And if you look at surveillance, there are processes to controlling urban space and actions, regardless of the nature actions. I'm referring to civic, but also political actions, is more hybrid compared to the Mukhabarat style approach that used to be there since the 1930s 1950s, I would say, up to 2011, 2012, if you don't mind. I'm not arguing that Mukhabarat is not there. They still play a very core role within the new architectures of power, political power, the mechanism of functioning in Nazi regimes. But this Mukhabarat approach is based on polarizing, patrolling urban spaces and areas that also used to be there under Mubarak. If you remember, no, if some of you are aware of Egyptian context under Mubarak, in Egypt you have al-Ashwayat, in Arabic they're called Ashwayat, which means informal areas. These areas used to be polarized and patrolled by police personnel on of Hosni Mubarak, just because of a certain, presence of Islamists, primarily Muslim Brotherhood within these areas. So under Sisi, we still have this kind of approach to polarizing, but at the same time, we have a more transversal approach to surveillance. And this transversality intersects also the new program of modernization, autocratic and industrial modernization that happened to centralize the entire logic of Assisi regimes. The main pillar on which Assisi is trying to, to build up its kind of perpetuations and resilience he wants to. In fact, it's not succeeding in this. I will touch upon this later if you don't mind. So we have this intersectionality, transversality that intertwines classical modes of policy surveillance. And the goal is essentially trying to make public space as apolitical as possible. There's no room for any kind of civic or political actions. And how is this being achieved? It's also through a new architecture of human spaces. So under the SDGs framework, and if you look at Egypt 2030, this ambitious plan for modernizing and Dubaizing, please let me use the terms Dubaizing Egypt, is everything but social justice and dignity and modernity. It's about suppressing also in the architecture the dynamics of through which also architecture speaks politics, if you want. And politics, architecture are intertwined. But I want to touch upon, I don't want to be too academic with this. So let's keep this aspect. The essential thing is that I have two cases here before turning to repression and political suppression. Look at spaces in Egypt and look at actions. They intertwine. And also you have two empirical examples, the Asmarat and the Maspero areas in downtown Cairo. If you look at Maspero areas under the program of Egypt 20, this project of Egypt 2030 and the entire SDG frameworks, and how nature and the environment are being institutionalized, if you want, weaponized, where human lives and nature are employed in service of global capitalism, and this is a new idea, green neoliberalism. You have a classical process to surveillance in Maspero area. Something I got from the field because it's no chance for me to, to conduct field work in Egypt. I think I joined a pool of researchers that have no access to this privilege, but what I got from the field for informants is that if you walk down to Maspero, to downtown Cairo, the Maspero area, you really see police personnel heavily armored, something that you couldn't see before, or at least until 5-6 years ago. This is something that you now can really see next to people sleeping in streets in downtown Cairo. And on the other hand, so this Maspero case, downtown Cairo speaks for this classical approach to surveillance. They're still there as part of the regime's logics of suppressing all forms of political actions and civic actions. But at the same time, you have Al-Asmarat, which I mentioned, you just heard it. Al-Asmarat is a social housing unit. It's not very far from, central Cairo, but it's more peripheral if you want to. You have two gates in Al-Asmarat. You have one gate for entering Asmarat and one gate for exiting Al-Asmarat. These two gates are policed, so you can see police personnel controlling both gates. If you live outside Al-Asmarat, if you're not a resident of Al-Asmarat, it's not just for you to access these areas, which means that there's a kind of overall discourse around the regulations of human lives. Of course, Al-Asmarat has been built under the premise and logics and narrative of emancipations, of dignity and improvements in the conditions of lives. But at the same time, so you really see from within this attempt of making subjectivities less political, or if you want, not political at all. So these are two mechanisms through which the machine is now operating under the incumbent. And it's very different from how the regime used to operate before 2011. At the same time, you have repression political parties. And until 2011, particularly mid-2000, party politics was tolerated under Mubarak regimes. They opened up to multi-party elections in the end of the 1990, early 2000, and then intensified this approach in the mid-2000. So we shift from the politics of partying to a politics of no partying at all, where there's no chance for any political parties or organization to emerge. There are few reasons for this, which once again must be found in the new architectures of the regime, or the regime system, essentially, or the political machine, which is threefold organized. I mean, it's a threefold level, if you want to. The first barrier is legal. The second is financial, so it's linked to material resources. And the third is relational. Now, as I said, if you look at the legal barriers, since 2013, I never seen something, I mean, I couldn't have access to material that speaks for this in pre-2011 settings. I'm not saying that Gamal Mubarak, sorry, Hosni Mubarak or Sadat or Nasser can be framed as a free sense. In fact, they were not. But if you look at the penal code, the jurisdictions, the legal foundations of the states, after 2013 up to 2016, these have been entirely rewritten. And the goal is to make all political actions, or actually all interventions by the state authority, legitimate under new legal premises that stands for the new foundations of the states, the new foundations of a new idea of regimes. And the barriers why parties, political parties can literally emerge, as I said, is legal, it's linked to material resources, the fact that we have new laws, new presidential decrees that make it possible for money to be channeled from the side towards Egypt under new terrorism law, and other presidential decrees that reinforces the anti-terrorism law and the discourse of security and protections of the homeland. In fact, the protections of this non-exclusivist, the personalist idea of the regime that just happened to emerge. And the last one is rational. As I said, the regime has been transformed from the substructural level. And in this new idea of non-exclusive personalism, we have more free relations. As I said, there's no pact between the Egyptian forces and Al-Sisi. Al-Sisi is much needed now to provide a civilian face to the regime, to deliver the hope successfully Egypt 2030 and stabilize the economy and the markets. So the further reason why it's impossible for parties to emerge is also due to relational reasons that regulate and dictate structures, relationships. What I got from the field as well, it's that there are conditions for a coup to take place in Egypt at the moment, but this coup is being delayed because there's no interest by local actors to stage a coup, to find support from society, which has been rewritten as well through Law 149 of 2019, approved in 2020. And through Law 149 of 2019, the authorities are trying to rewrite the identity of a civil society. Also trying to provide new identity to NGOs and environmental NGOs. And this new plan for rewriting the identity of civil society and groups and organizations that operates within it also attached to this idea of Egypt 2030 and the SDGs framework, in the way they're trying to create committees, local committees that support the idea of environmentalism or civic engagements through the prism of environmentalism. So a new idea, a kind of hierarchically built and centralized idea of NGOs, environmental NGOs, that now operates not just in central Cairo, but also in suburban area and rural areas. So these are the three reasons for which the regime now operates, but there is a problem to this. The problem is that despite this idea of or kind of external idea of stability that is promoted by international actors, I would say primarily the IMF, Fitch, rating agencies that just recently was in February this year. Fitch categorized Egypt as with a B. B stands for stable. But the reason why this B was assigned to Egypt, once again, is for political reason rather than for strictly financial market-oriented reason. Because if you look at macro data, if you look at monetary policies, they don't speak for stability, I'm afraid. The same can be said for political consensus toward the performance, the economic performance of the ruler of authorities. So this idea of stability, which is very tactical, is very strategic, but internally, I'm afraid that the regime looks stable. In fact, it's not. It's brittle. And this idea of brittleness is attached to this fluidity, these very fragile relationships that intertwines the legitimate forces and the elite, as more broadly conceived, to the figure of the political figure, political authority of Abdel Fattah Sisi. And I will also add on this, again, once again, something that I got from my fieldworks and from the field. There are attempts by the Muslim Brotherhood to organize the organizations, but not in Egypt. These are dialogue that has already taken place, but it's taking place elsewhere, not in the country. So the civil society is still suppressed, it's not there. And the regime remains brittle also in terms of economic data, it's in terms of monetary policies, in terms of neglect approaches to the private sector, which struggling to expand for structural barriers, but also because of the informal sector, that the black economy is still there and accounts for 40–50% of the GDP, while it absorbs more than 60% of the labor force, something that the authorities are not reforming. So we have some main struggles from economic financial perspective that have been neglected by authorities, and they will impact, apart from inflation rates, the free floating of the currency as well, the Egyptian pounds. So there are some indicators that do not speak for financial economic stability, I'm afraid. And on top of this, you have a very precarious and porous political situation on the ground that speaks for intra-actors, intra-state fragmentations, still in absence of civil society and political actions. With this in mind, I want to conclude just trying to reply one main question. To what extent the collapse of Bashar regime pose a threat to al-Sisi regimes or to Egypt, okay? Well, the collapse of Bashar al-Assad does not pose a direct threat to the regime in Egypt. I want to be straightforward on this. There's no chance that the regimes will collapse any soon, nor in the short, nor in the midterm. And the reason is simple. The first thing is that the first reason is because al-Sisi is much needed, despite its fragility, despite its first attempt of perpetuating himself and the authority, is still needed internally by legitimate forces and also internationally. And the second reason is because, once again, there are some, it's a kind of belief that if the regime would collapse, the entire region would be turned into a chaos. I have some doubts about the still impacting role of Egypt in the region, for at least from a diplomatic perspective, but it could be a chaos if Egypt would collapse. So it's in the diplomatic and economic interest to keep Abdel Fattah Sisi where is it now, at least for the foreseeable future. And the anxiety and fear that Sisi shared about the collapse of Bashar al-Assad regime is more a symptom of lack of political consciousness and trust toward the authority, because it's considered not knowledgeable and very brittle, at least when the brittleness is attached to the personalist traits of the regime, but not the still kind of interiorized substructural elements that still support this hybrid idea of Egyptian regimes under Abdel Fattah Sisi. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Gloria, for that very thorough presentation and sort of highlighting all these different ways in which the regime has tried to bolster itself, and the very different dynamics at play both internally and externally. That really gives us a very good overview, I think. Okay, so we'll turn now to Kevin for the Tunisian case.
All right, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me and for organizing this. I think this is a very interesting exchange. I start with a little technical note. My voice is a bit destroyed because I'm slowly recovering from an infection of my lungs. I was hoping, thank you, Gamal. I was hoping it would be a bit more advanced at this point. So I hope there will not be too much coughing as I go through this. So that said, I was asked to speak about the resilience of autocracy in Tunisia. And of course, in the Tunisian case, the resilience of autocracy is a forward-looking question, right? If you want to call it an autocratic regime, it's maybe 1 or 2 years old at this point in Tunisia. And so I think it's a very interesting question to speculate about the potential resilience of this regime, also maybe against the background of what we've seen in Egypt over the last decade, a bit more than a decade even now. So I will not bother you necessarily with kind of the usual hook about Tunisia, the success story of the Arab Spring, and now look what happened and blah, 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 because I think this is seductively simple but mistaken message about Tunisia. It's mistaken for 2 reasons. One, it draws our attention to what Tunisia is moving away from, which is this supposed success story of democratic transition. And so, democratic backsliding is a much more attractive frame for various reasons in our discipline compared to authoritarian consolidation. But I think if you want to understand the question of resilience and prospects for resilience, if you like, and also prospects for democratic forces to change something about that, then we need to look at the regime that is emerging. We need to look at the new regime coalition that is emerging. And this perspective on the undermining of democracy really doesn't allow us to do that. And the second, I think, more important reason from a, let's say, Tunisia perspective is that, this frame of Tunisia as an exceptional success story glosses over the fact that these 10 years of democratic transition in the country itself are not seen, by no means universally seen, as a resounding success, right? This is not to suggest, obviously, that all Tunisians or a majority of Tunisians agree with this framing of the period of democratic transition as a black decade that we now hear from Kais Saied. But it is simply to note that the 10 years of democracy between 2011 and 2021 have not solved some of the structural issues that were behind the initial revolution in 2010-11. Thinking about disparity, like unequal economic development, thinking about unemployment, structural issues in that sense. that has not been addressed. And plus, on top of that, of course, there was the acute crisis of COVID. Now, this all made the post-revolutionary political class, in particular party political elites, an easy target for Kais Said's particular brand of authoritarian, anti-representative, and in particular anti-party populism. But I will return to this later on in my remarks. Now, I will structure my talk in 3 parts. First, I want to briefly recount the main steps of democratic backsliding and then also authoritarian consolidation since July 21. Following this, I will then I would like to look into the let's say the political project of Kais Said, if you can call it that, and the extent to which this resonates among Tunisians. And then I will conclude with some thoughts about basically speculating about what this all might mean for the future resilience of autocracy in Tunisia and where we might expect resistance to originate from. Now, I don't want to be too exhaustive with the story of democratic backsliding or democratic breakdown in Tunisia, because you all know the story, right? We start with July 25th, 2021, so the original autogolpe, and then there's a number of steps after that. I would mention Decree 117 of September 2021, which in a sense made permanent this state of exception and gave the president the ability to rule by decree. Then you have in February of 2022 the subjugation of the judicial branch with the dissolution of the Supreme Council of the Judiciary. You have in June of the same year this famous incident where Kais Said fired 57 judges, which was kind of at the same time a purge, but also a signal to other members of the judicial branch. You have the final dissolution of parliament on the 30th of March 2022, and in the same month, the reappointment of the Electoral Commission with handpicked members loyal to the president. And so all of this is kind of the what I would call authoritarianism by subtraction, right? The undermining of democratic institutions, pre-existing democratic institutions. We then enter the period that I think is more important for what we're interested in here today, which is the period of institution building, right? So what replaces these pre-existing authoritarian institutions, democratic institutions, what kind of authoritarian institutions are emerging? Here, we have to start with a new constitution adopted a year after the initial autogolpe, so on 25th July 2022, by referendum. Turnout was very low, approval was very high, so that's very typical for authoritarian electoral exercises. And the constitution itself significantly strengthened the presidency. Of course, it's a hyper-presidentialist constitution, especially parliament is extremely weakened. It basically even lost the power of the purse, which is kind of the power of parliaments anywhere. But, and this is also interesting, I will come back to this later, it also stopped short of implementing this vision that Kais Said had been formulating not only since he became president, but from since 2013 at least, this idea of construction from below. Then under the new constitution, of course, we have legislative elections that were held in December 2022 and January 23, so in 2 rounds. These elections are interesting because basically they illustrate how institutions and the engineering of institutions can be used to depoliticize politics in a sense, right? So what Kais Said did here, or what the leadership did, was to localize these elections, right? And so a competition was really about who would renovate the agricultural road in the district, or renovate the sports palace or stuff like that, but not about constitutional issues, not about the political future of the country. And this is in a country that had just undergone a massive political crisis. And so you might have expected that some of this might come up in electoral campaigns as well. It did not. And the new kind of institutional framework here is a big part of the reason, I would argue. Also, these elections, turnout stood at 12%, which is probably also a sign for the depoliticization, which made it very uninteresting for many people to vote, and interesting for very specific people who had very specific local concerns that they could hope to implement through their electoral participation, basically trading their votes for whatever promise they received in return. Then we had presidential elections in October 2024. But at this point, few people were holding their breath regarding the result. And indeed, Kais Saied, as you all know, swept the highly controlled contest with a 90%, 28% turnout. So this is, again, a typical case of authoritarian elections. All of this went along with a massive repressive campaign targeting perceived political opponents, journalists, civil society at large, and even, and this is something, of course, that we are observing quite closely as in my research project, even foreign researchers in the country. So what is the kind of legitimizing idea behind Kais Saied's political project? At the core of this discourse, anyway, of legitimation is a specific type of analysis of the weak spots of the kind of early transitional period, so the early post-2011 political developments in the country. Kais Saied, then still a constitutional law professor, published an interesting pamphlet in 2013 called For a New Foundation, in which he talked about the actual aims of the revolution and the Kasper sit-in, and how the constitutional process after 2011 had stolen these actual ideals, or had made it impossible to realize them. So this is a long-standing concern that he has, right? And something that I would argue is not an ex post justification, but an actual concern. So what he says here is that the revolution, and this is a quote, aimed at a definite rupture with all that has given rise to oppression, humiliation, and tyranny, and quote, and to, and this is another quote, establish a constitutional framework through which the people can regain their full sovereignty and all the rights and wealth which have been stolen from them. And this is something that is recurring in his rhetoric, right? The emphasis on sovereignty, the emphasis on wealth that has been stolen, the revolution that has been stolen by somebody. There's usually haulai, those people, right? They're not named, but they're there, right? They're shadowy. This is a typical rhetorical figure of populists anywhere, and Kais Saied uses this very frequently. Now, according to Saied, and this is kind of the positive element of his political project, kind of what he wants to replace the representative system, and we're here talking about the period before 2014. So this is still the Constitutional Assembly in Tunisia. He wants to replace this party-based assembly with a bottom-up kind of assembly elected on a very local level, which would then delegate up from the delegation level, which is the second lowest administrative level in Tunisia, to the provincial level, and then to the national level. So some people have said this is similar to Gaddafi's institutional vision. I was frankly reminded of the early political organization in the Russian Revolution, this council system. But this is kind of what was going on there. And it's also not a coincidence that this thinking was for a while, and to some extent still is in some circles, popular among some parts of the Tunisian left, right, who recognize this similarity. Now, this project has, of course, been described as populist. It is populist in a sense, but it is a very Tunisian version of populism that is very directly anchored in the political experience of the country since 2011. So the question is, to what extent does this resonate among Tunisians. Now, here we have a fundamental problem, which has to do with the development of Tunisia over the last years. And this is that it seems currently impossible to conduct independent public opinion research in the country. We have tried with my project and have not succeeded. I know that the people at the Arab Barometer are facing the same problem. And so we cannot really freely collect the type of information that we would need in order to answer this question seriously. What we can do is to look at public opinion data collected up to 2022, and then we can say roughly the following. Populism, and in particular anti-elite attitudes, were extremely widespread in Tunisia. Let's say we're talking here 2019, 2020 as the time frame, so when the Kais Saied phenomenon emerged. And in fact, they were so widespread that they become a bit useless as explanatory factors, right? Because if everybody hates the political class and the elite, this is not a very good explanation for support for Kais Saied, because not everybody supported Kais Saied, obviously. At the same time, there's also, if you look at various opinion polls, there is a significant part of the Tunisian population who dream of some ideal of efficient, strong leadership, right? That gets things done. This is something that's very common in new democracies. And this set of attitudes, which I have dubbed hyper-presidentialist, is strongly related to support for Kais Saied and his exceptional measures. So this really seems to be where some of this is coming from. Finally, and this is also interesting, this all does not mean that support for democracy as an ideal or idea is waning in Tunisia, right? So there is a kind of a cognitive dissonance here, right? All institutions associated with democracy, parliament, parties, elites, all of this representation is extremely unpopular, but democracy as such is not. And that, I mean, this is also not something that is specific to Tunisia, but still, I think this is something important to point out, that there is not a kind of a wave of pro-authoritarian sentiment in the country. Now, in conclusion, I want to kind of make 2 points about what all of this means. One is, if we wonder about the question of resilience, I think the problem that we're facing in Tunisia is that Kais Saied has been very good at undermining institutions, has been very good at excluding people, even people who wanted to support him, right? But he has really not been good and has really not made any effort to build some kind of structure that would support his regime. And I think this will come back to bite him at one point, right? He cannot draw on the military as Sisi can in Egypt. He does not have a movement or party, at least not an organized one, right? There were attempts by people from his kind of environment to do this, but he refuses this kind of these kinds of attempts. And so that is a major weakness, I think, a major organizational weakness that will not necessarily lead to opposition emerging, but that might lead to ineffectiveness in organizing the regime, right? Because it becomes hard to decide who to put where if you don't have an organization that does this kind of stuff for you. That's what parties do in autocracies, right? And there is no party or party-like organization in Tunisia at the moment. The second element, and this points in kind of the opposite direction, is I think we have a fairly permissive international environment for Kais Saied at the moment, including, I'm talking to you from Italy. You know, there is the famous migration deal concluded in 2023, and Italy, of course, was one of the driving forces there. This is certainly not single-handedly propping up the regime, but it's helping, right? It's helping to give just simply financial room for maneuver and a kind of sense of international legitimacy, which certainly helps the regime to stay afloat. So these are the kind of countervailing forces that I see when it comes to the prospects of resilience, where might opposition come from? And this is the very last point that I will make. I think opposition can only come from below at this point. I don't think there is, we have to hold our breath that the military will do something or any of these sorts. The Tunisian military is not of that sort, and it has been moving closer to Kais Saied rather than away from him. But of course, the structural causes of Kais Saied's rise and the revolution before are still there. And so to the extent that these structural causes will remain, there might be political instability. Now, what this might produce in terms of an alternative political order is on a completely different page. And here, I think the military then might actually play an important role. And so from a very large perspective, what might be the consequence of Kais Saied is the transformation of the Tunisian military into a much more politicized actor. On this optimistic note, I will yield the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for adding that framing, moving away from sort of the democratic backsliding and what that does for us to think about resilience, and even it's sort of taking a longer term perspective, right, looking backward and forward at the same time. And thank you for soldiering through despite your infection. Okay, so we'll turn now for the Syrian case, sort of providing a different kind of example where we've actually seen the consequences of the state fragility play out in sort of a very dramatic format. So Gamma, please.
So thank you for hosting this, Sarah. So thank you for the Air Reform Initiative, and thank you for Gloria and Kevin. You've done great. Your voices sounded brilliant, and you soldiered through. So more power to you. Thank you also for the explanation, and it helps set up my case. So I feel like I'm one of the last Sovietologists on Earth. I'm studying a regime that was supposed to be resilient, that was supposed to be coup-proof, that was supposed to be one of the longest standing authoritarian regimes, that was uncollapsible, that has collapsed. So sort of kind of feel like I'm lost in transition here. But I'm glad to be speaking of the Assad regime in past tense, because as a Palestinian Syrian, I suffered twice from underneath this regime. I lived all my life. I'm 53 years old right now. All my waking life was under an Assad regime, was under an authoritarian regime of the brutalist type that we know of right now. It sounded resilient until it wasn't. And that's the story, basically, of what I'm going to say. Resilience is what you sort of make of it. It is transitory. It is not as lasting as we think of. And when we're talking about resilience, I think we need to qualify that with a temporariness, even if it's a long duration type of thing. The way that the Assad regime basically maintained itself was through a mix of hegemonizing public space, of creating manners of trying to coerce and cajole social and economic classes, but also of dominating through emptying, basically creating a moat between itself and the rest of society. The story that Kevin was telling, story that Gloria was pointing to, this was done by Assad's father. Now, the problems started when Assad, as a son, he did not create this regime, he inherited it. And he did not realize he had only a realization of the potential. He had overlearned the lessons of the durability and resilience of his father's regime. So his father's regime went through several iterations where it looked like it was going to collapse, but then the region stopped short of pushing that regime over, or tipping it over for the last kind of inch. His own experience in power started with 2003 and the American invasion of Iraq. He was about to fall, but then the Americans stopped short of invading. So he made good on that promise of surviving. 2005, him being implicated in the Hariri killing. He thought this was going to be it. He weathered that storm. Somebody in the region sort of kind of helped to push him over that, and he survived that. And then 2011 happened. And he kind of pushed the envelope until he used his first chemical weapons attack in 2013. No one intervened to tip him over. And then the Russians came in 2015 based on his and the Iranians' request to do so, and he survived it. So by 2024, he thought, hey, I'm pretty stable. I mean, everybody hates me, but they're going to have to deal with me because my fall is that significant. And I've been able to empty the moats around me in Syria to a point where even my own internal group, which fight amongst each other and want to get rid of me as soon as they can, cannot fathom my disappearance. So I've coup-proofed myself on the inside by making myself indispensable, a la Sisi, as Gloria was telling us. I think Sisi was looking at Assad and learning certain things. Qais Said is also looking and learning. And everybody thinks that they're the ones that know how to do it right. They're the ones who know how to avoid the pitfalls, but pick what works. Assad too was thinking that same way. And by 2024, he was in dire situation. He was, his public support had long disappeared. His own internal base of power had eroded to a degree where he was standing on a toothpick, but he thought, hey, I've survived worse. I'm now indispensable. The entire regional order does not support me falling and Syria becoming a big hole. Who are they going to let replace me? An Al-Qaeda offshoot? Never. So I'm indispensable. That is why he turned down the hand that was extended to him in sort of like a business-like kind of manner from the Saudis, from the UAE, but also from the Turks. And he thought he could say no, 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 and maximize his returns because he didn't have anything to give back anyways. So authoritarian resilience in that sense, internally and externally by the Assad regime, is a lesson to be learned from the wannabe autocrats that want to survive for a longer period of time in the region. But it also tells a great deal about how you can overlearn sometimes from the stability that you've created, from the longevity of your regime, from the indispensability of your regime in terms of, like, for example, what Gloria was telling us about if Egypt were to fall, chaos would reign supreme. I totally agree. But then it works until it doesn't, because regional orders change, because priorities change, because something that is intolerable right now could be tolerable in the future, and so on and so forth. I'm not saying this is going to happen in the Egyptian case. I'm not saying this. I'm not suggesting that it's happening in the Tunisian case. All I'm saying is these authoritarian regimes overlearn the lessons of authoritarian stability. The Assad regime is a prime example of that. The way that the Assad regime tried to do authoritarian upgrading basically was something that was coined to describe actually Bashar al-Assad's term in power since he assumed the presidency after the death of his father, inherited in 2000 by Stephen Heidemann. Authoritarian upgrading in the Assad case was to basically offset the state's overt control over the economy and social spaces and delegate that off to crony business people, to non-governmental, governmental organizations. So a GONGO, a governmental, non-governmental organizational structure that was handled by the First Lady through her own involvement in civil society, so to speak. So create a state controlled civil society that then becomes the state's arm of controlling civil society, making the regime look good and beneficiary and munificent towards society, offset the subsidies that the state was assuming under Assad's father, and allowing for capital accumulation to happen that then will be funneled through the crony business people to the regime elite themselves, not even to the state. And utilizing the importance of Syria as a key factor in regional stability to then offset the cost of resubsidizing, these popular classes that were reliant on the state during the period of statism from the 60s onwards, where the state basically excised the private sector from any kind of productive role in the economy and assumed itself the role of the prime employer, but also the prime producer in the Syrian economy. That was now receding because the state was failing. Unemployment was still and became even a more rife problem. And then neoliberal thought was we're going to trickle down and do those magic tricks that never work anyways. But then to offset the balance of the failure that's going to generate, so there's going to be a lot of money, but that's going to go into few hands. What are we going to do with the base? We're going to actually make that the problem of the entire region and the world. So Europeans, if you want us to be, a stabilizing factor, if you don't want refugees like what happened afterwards, coming your way out of economic, need or some kind of instability, you're going to have to support us. So you're going to have to give us money. You're going to have to, provide us with programs, the United States, and so on and so forth. So it was kind of also a mafia-esque kind of, shakedown on a constant basis that worked until it stopped working. So also, again, this kind of Tunisian model, so Kevin was speaking of the migrant, the migrant crisis being used as leverage. It works until it stops. Egypt too did that for a while, tried to shake down the European Union specifically. I mean, we can open the floodgates and then good luck dealing with all these African and Libyan migrants that are going to jump, the Mediterranean and flood your gates. It works until it stops working. So to make a long story short, the Assad regime tells us a great deal about how these authoritarian regimes attempt to modernize by offsetting, by liberalizing the economy, basically a Potemkin village kind of facade of, hey, look at us, we're liberal economically, we're conservative or authoritarian, politically, but we maintain stability. And that's a good thing for you, fellow Syrians or fellow Egyptian or fellow Tunisians, because we're the ones stopping this from going haywire, because if it's not me, then it's chaos. And for the region and the entire world, we are in a key area of this world for you. You don't want the floodgates to be open with refugees. You don't want the instability that this might cause to global supply chains, energy, et cetera, et cetera. So you need to tolerate us and, give us a lifeline so that we can continue doing what we're doing. This worked until it stopped working. And if there's anything that could be gained out of the Syrian example, in my opinion right now, it is the limitations of this authoritarian resilience and the need to look at resilience contextually, not use it as a moot or a kind of reified category that then becomes kind of like taken as a given. I think resilience is very, very brittle. It's very exposable, and it is very contextual, and it works until it doesn't. And I hope that I'm going to be one of the few Middle Easterners who speak less than the time that they're allotted. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you for, bringing out these offsetting strategies. Actually, I think that's quite interesting. And speaking about the need to really deeply contextualize, because that does sort of lend, shake up that idea, sort of the everlasting nature of this, that as context changes, so do the strategies and the resilience. All right. I had a few questions that I wanted to ask, and I am conscious of time, so I'll try not to take up too much time with my questions. Actually, I think we've addressed them. in the discussion already. I was going to have some questions about the implications, but I think both speakers, both Gloria and Kevin, addressed that already, the implications of what happened in Syria for the cases in Egypt and Tunisia. So I think we'll go ahead in this case and open up to the audience. We have a question. What are these legitimate forces inside Egypt? This is a question for Maria. What are these legitimate forces inside Egypt that you were referring to?
Sorry, forgot to unmute me. In terms of legitimate forces in Egypt, as I said before, legitimacy at the moment is a complex matter in the country, and is essentially based on what I've just done in my just published book, to tell the truth. And it takes at least, it develops along 3 levels, if you want, but in terms of forces, I'm afraid, legitimacy now is structures in terms of legal access. It's not Weberian conception, because applying Weber to Egypt is quite obsolete. I work on a different framework and a different hybrid transdisciplinary approach, but I don't want to touch upon it a bit too academic. So to keep it simple as possible, we have 3 levels here. Of course, the legal foundations of the state that's been written and that's been used as a weapon to then implement no legal foundation, no legal legitimacy, but to build up on charisma. But the charisma is different. It's no charisma in the very sense. It was initially attached to Assisi, but ended up turning to something different. And then from charisma, we moved to a different role in different position in the states and political and religious authorities, religious representatives, referring to the Salafis, referring to other religious forces, less represent the political religious forces in the country, and then end up with economy, which is a different discussion. It will be a different discussion here. But when it comes to legitimate forces, I don't see at the moment forces that go beyond the state itself. So essentially, if the gentlemen or the ladies, I mean, are referring to popular forces of legitimation for which the regime is trying to build up a legitimation claim as an attempt, I'm afraid that from a bottom-up perspective, the floor is totally empty. But if you look at, as I said, intra-states relationships, intra-state actors, legitimacy is not built on charismatic or authority-related dynamics. It's more a matter of business interest and the capacity of authority to deliver a stable, to stabilize the economy, to deliver a stable, a stable plan for recovery in the country. But at the same time, these forces very precarious and are not supporting legitimations, the political legitimations of the status quo. It's more based on, as I said, and I reiterate, on interest, and interests are very porous. It means that essentially it's difficult to think of achieve legitimacy. If you look at some independent data, third parties data on consensus built in Egypt, it has dropped. We have a dramatic drop since 2006. Some are very much higher than the 2011, referring to the mid-20s, when the country hoping to kind of tolerate some kind of more democratized infrastructures for tactical reason. The tactical reason for just, negotiate the China money from the European Union, because the condition was, okay, you are going to transfer money under the ENPI instrument. The ENPI instrument has been replaced by the NDIC instrument, at least from the EU perspective. Now, the condition was, okay, I'm going to, democratize, or look more democratic from the side. In fact, I'm not democratizing my nature, my identity, but in return, I expect money to be channeled from the European Union, support of my mechanism of perpetuation, because this is what we're talking about. The same logic applies now in Egypt to some extent. So there's no legitimacy. It's a dropped. Consensus building is minimum. If you look at economic data, they're very porous. Monetary policies are very fragile. There's some kind of optimism, but be very cautious in referring to this data in optimistic way. The same applies to political economic data. The same applies to the inflation rates and the global markets, how the international scenario will affect in the future the stability of Egypt's economy, which is everything but stable. So the legitimacy is something that it looks as existent from the side, is not from the within. There are no bottom-up forces. Everything is or must be conceptualized as is organized from within the sub-hierarchies of the state system and the regime systems. And here I want to separate the identity of the regime from the identity of the state for the first time, because since the 1950s, we have an overlap between the two concepts, identity of the state versus the regime. Now we have a kind of more cut-off separation between the two. So legitimacy, as I said, it looks like it's there. In fact, it's not. And these forces are very opportunistic, but not real.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, we have another question, and I believe this is addressed to all three speakers, which is about the role of support and public support and state support to Palestine in the current context and how this shapes the authoritarian calculus. I'm thinking in particular for Egypt at the moment, where there has been significant pressure put onto the Sisi regime to act a certain way with regards to Gaza, especially from both the Biden and the Trump administration. But more broadly, we've seen similar dynamics in both Tunisia and now with Shara and the question of sanctions and how this shapes the calculus. So for all three of you, how is the issue of Palestine? How does this how does this get calculated into the practice of authoritarianism and the forms of support? Yes, go ahead.
So I'm going to just piggyback off what Gloria was speaking about for the last question, which is legitimacy. This is a new regime. We're talking about a transition from an authoritarian regime into a different regime. We don't know yet. It's still too early to tell what type of regime we're looking at. If you're asking me, my money is on the regional order tolerating an authoritarian regime, not a democratic transition. All the backers of the current regime are in different stages of authoritarianism. MBS is certainly not a Westminster democracy, heading a Westminster democracy. Turkey under Erdogan has moved from a competitive authoritarianism to authoritarianism of sorts. Egypt doesn't have much weight in terms of like regional calculus as it used to have in the 1950s vis-a-vis Syria, but it still does not want to see a democratic transition happen in Syria after a popular revolt, because it'll give everybody in the region the wrong idea that, oh, if you persist to you know a little more time, then maybe you can topple an authoritarian regime and then replace it successfully with a democracy. So what type of authoritarian regime is being shaped in Syria right now is under question. However, it will not be as brutal as the Assad regime has been because of a regional distaste for that kind of regime, because of the consequences that it has shown, basically the migratory moves, you know, the kind of a narco state that it turned into, but also in terms of Syrians themselves being able to fathom such type of regime. So in order for regional stability to be maintained, some form of authoritarianism is tolerated, but to what degree is now being negotiated. Having said that, this regime does not enjoy the legitimacy that it wants to claim for itself yet. It has the legitimacy of having been instrumental in toppling the regime that everybody in Syria hated. That is one. The second is that it's trying sort of, and it fails at different moments. So the massacres that were happening in the coastal region against the Alawites, now around Damascus in certain areas, Jaramana and today Sahnaya, that are heavily populated with Druze and Christian populations, are being under attack by forces that are either on the sidelines of or part of the regime of Ahmad al-Shara. So there are contentions that are happening because the legitimacy is still unstable, and the fact that it can hold Syria together, which was claimed to legitimacy, is still unstable. All of this is to say that it also the regime seeks its regional legitimacy by becoming a part of zero problems with the region type of regime, unlike the Assad regime, which was a kind of mafia-esque type of regime, which used threat and protection racket type of behavior to gain in regional stability, but in posture and also legitimacy. Part of that picture is to try and seek a type of no problem pact with Israel today. So there is, I can tell you without, I too, like Kevin, don't think that it's possible to go down to Syria and do, a poll of what people want with any degree of, kind of statistical, correctness. However, I can tell you, based on having gone to Syria twice in the past few months of being Syrian and speaking to a lot of Syrians, there is a high degree of tolerance of seeking a negotiated settlement with Israel and having a non-aggression type of stance vis-a-vis Israel. Nobody wants to go into conflict with Israel. Nobody wants to do a war type or like a war footing or like getting into a battle with Israel. That being said, that does not mean warm relations or completely forgetting about the Palestinian cause. Some kind of mindset is kind of a no war, no war and peace kind of negotiated settlement with Israel is tolerable to the Syrian population, because the understanding is we have paid more than enough. We've footed that bill for too long, and look what we've gotten for it. We cannot support an ongoing Palestinian-Israeli conflict by military means, by material support, by even loud political support, as the previous regime was, performatively trying to do any longer. So while we are not going to be friendly with Israel, we certainly don't want any conflict with Israel. And if Shara plays that card, according to that kind of, holding things in the, like we say in Arabic, yimsek al-asa min al-nas, kind of being in the mid-level, where we're sending a positive message to the region, but also to the Israelis that, we don't want to be in conflict with you, but we certainly don't want to be buddying up to you. If that works, then Syrians in a great deal will not be objecting to that. The problem for the current regime is, by the way, today there were like these conflagrations between security forces and, Druze-led security forces in the regions that I just described around Damascus, that happened to coincide with an aerial bombardment on the Israeli side of weapons depot and government, militarized forces around Damascus at the same time. Israel is invested in doing an either or to the Ahmad Shara regime right now, and that's the last thing I'm going to say and open the floor for everybody else, of putting them under an extreme type of pressure where, no, you don't get to have your cake or eat it too. you have to come with a warm, peace, open negotiation where you concede to our, maximized points of pressure and give us everything that we want and do it openly and concede. We don't want to give you, a kind of, yeah, okay, so we're going to tolerate them ad minimum, agreement where you don't get embarrassed or humiliated. No, we want you to come to the table and sign a piece of concession where we look like the victors and you look like you've just conceded everything. Shutout doesn't want that. The regional backers of a shutout like Saudi Arabia and Turkey don't want him to have that, because that will go to destroy any legitimacy he has inside Syria, but also regionally and externally. The Israelis want to use that window of opportunity that they have to pressure the shutout regime to a corner and either get a concession, out of him, and then, okay, whatever, you can deal with whatever problems this creates to you, or no peace. And we're going to continue beating you over the head and continue pressuring you into a corner. So 2 things. Syrians do not mind peace with Israel as long as it doesn't have that kind of warmth and, completely openly, verbalizing we've abandoned support for the Palestinians on the side of the regime, because that will delegitimize the entire situation. And this is not what Syrians want. They want to continue being able to be sympathetic and empathetic, but at minimum contribution to the Palestinian cause. The Israelis, on the other hand, don't want this. It's an either or binary. Either you give in to what our demands are completely, and then you can have your peace, and whatever that cost is offset onto you, you deal with it, or no peace. And we're going to go and pressure you to the maximum extent where, if that means the destruction of the unity of Syria, then so be it. Sorry for being a little too lengthy in that.
To touch on Egypt, if you don't mind, and then try to answer the questions about Palestine and Palestinian solidarity in Egypt, and then how this intertwined with the stability of the regime. There are 2 levels here, the domestic and the regional, of course. If you look at the domestic level, just to go back to 2006 and what happened during the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada was had on top of other internal domestic grievances that ultimately led to the historicity of 2000 uprising. I'm going to say that pro-Palestinian protest in 2000 led to the uprising directly, but in the internal factors just exasperated the anti-regime sentiment, and then end up with what we know the outcome was the 2000 uprising. So when it comes to the incumbent, there are some protests that try to attempt to be organized in Cairo, not just in Cairo, but they just died away, because the same logic applies. We're going to take the streets, we're going to arrest you under new anti-protest law. So there's no chance even for pro-Palestinian protest, small-scale manifestations to just happen even in a more peaceful way, because they perceive it as a kind of indirect threat to the stability of the regime because of what happened in 2000, at least from a historical comparative perspective. So these are conditions on the ground. The fact that all specific actions are just suppressed under the new legal foundations of the states, and the new laws that apply still are enacted. When it comes in terms instead to the regional perspective, of course, Sisi has to show some solidarity to what's happening in Gaza Strip, and the situations in Palestine. And there are 2 reasons here why this must happen comes from Sisi. BNB are still in Egypt, despite being jailed, suppressed, cracked down, whatever he wants. Something that you can also find in the book. This is not promotion, but something that I wrote. There are some MB members that still exist and still are in the legitimate forces and fragment the legitimate forces. So we know that MB are very close to, up in history, to be very close to Hamas movements. So that kind of, not operational, but a kind of ideological continuity between the MB and Hamas, despite some internal transformations and then attempt of moderations from, of course, the MB. But the points that Assisi will expect to say, it shows support toward Palestinians, also because of these subcomponents that still exist within the legitimate structures. And secondly, because pro-Palestinian sentiments are very intimate to the entire Arab region, despite laws and barriers or any kind of forms that suppress genuine manifestation to just happen even in a more peaceful way. But despite this, I don't think there's no chance for 1979 agreement to be affected. So there will be peace peace that will keep existing between Israel and Egypt, and Egypt will be more interested in security. And if you look at the relocations plan, Palestinians and Egyptian lands on the Sinai Peninsula, actually. These are based on different logics of securitizations on one end, but also the fact that these relocations, it seems they're assigned to an Egyptian contractor, a Bedouin contractor, Al-Horgani, who was very close to Abdel Fattah Sisi and is building this, this is Sisi city in the Sinai Peninsula. So once again, these logics of securitizations versus modernizations versus perpetuations are very tough and very complex, but at the same time, I don't see there won't be any disagreements, any frictions between Israel and Egypt. They will be very good friends, to say, for the next future, but solidarity is still compromised because of fears, because of hurdles of stability.
Thank you. Kevin, did you have anything you wanted to add about that, about the issue of Palestine?
I can say a couple of words. I mean, of course, Tunisia is a bit more removed from the whole problem. There is no, Israeli invasion of the country in contrast to Syria. And there is also no border with Gaza in contrast to Egypt. Kais Saied has always been rhetorically very strongly pro-Palestinian. And he's using this, because the question was for the authoritarian calculus, he's using this as a legitimizing device towards public opinion. I recall kind of this incident, I don't know if you remember this, of this storm called Daniel, which he associated with Zionist infiltration when it hit. This is the kind of level, right? It's not serious. And so the question would be, to what extent would, when push came to shove, would this actually be a political position, or is this a mere rhetorical device that is fairly cheap to use because Tunisia does not have a major role to play in this context? I would come down without having any evidence that this is a rhetorical device that he uses, because it's there for the using. And so that is, I think, the political function of support for Palestine from the Tunisian regime at the moment.
All right, thank you very much. We had a few last questions, but I think we actually are out of time at this point. So I wanted to just thank our speakers for such a wonderful discussion, such a vivid discussion this whole afternoon, for this last hour and a half. It's been really very thoughtful, all of your reflections, the questions, and really dialoguing with the different issues that we had brought up today. There will be a recording that will be available of this, I believe, as of Friday. It should be alive. So feel free to share this or to go back to this at any time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.